You know, it occurs to me that the Hollywood people really missed a trick by not casting Ryan Reynolds as Jay Gatsby. After all, he was already the Green Lantern and Deadpool. Well, another month has passed us by. March really seems to have flown past, as a matter of fact, and we're now embarking upon April of 2025. What a strange sort of a month this is going to be. Later this month, just a few days apart from each other, the Christians are going to celebrate their holiest day on their calendar, and the Americans celebrate the evilest day on their calendar. I refer, of course, to Easter and to Tax Day. But before we can get to those, we need to observe our own monthly tradition here on this channel, wherein I review all the books I read over the last month. Before we do that, just in case you're new here, this is, as you might guess, a horror channel, so of course these monthly book review videos are horror-centric, but just as this channel branches out to talk about spooky things other than just books, we're talking movies, games, props, true crime, whatever, so does my reading sometimes branch out to topics other than horror. Longtime viewers know that there's always some good creepy literature in these reviews, but you never quite know what else might pop up because I have pretty eclectic tastes, and this month is going to be no exception to that. Hopefully you'll find some of these books that I'm reviewing interesting. If you do, and if you want to get copies for yourselves, I've conveniently placed purchase links right down there in the What's It, and of course I'd appreciate anyone who supports my channel by using those links. Additional ways you can help me on my quest to take over the world one ghost story at a time include liking, commenting on, and sharing this video, and do of course also make sure that you're subscribed to this channel and have rung that notifications bell so you don't miss out on any future videos. But also don't limit yourself to future videos. If you are new here, I've got a pretty long backlist you should check out wherein I review books, I talk about movies, I build things, and generally share all the weird thoughts that cross my spooky mind. But for today, that's quite enough jibber-jabber. All we really want to know about are the books I'm reviewing. I actually read quite a lot this month, but most of what I read were unpublished manuscripts that I'm either editing or reviewing for my publishing house. Nevertheless, I do have a good collection of 9 books I can review, and they're a pretty good mix of different kinds of things. So let's go right ahead and get started. If you happen to catch last month's book review video, and if you didn't, check it out, but if you did, you know that I've been reading some horror classics of late. I've been in that sort of a mood, I guess. And I started this month off on very much the same trend. The first of those was Arthur Machen's The Great God Pan. The novel starts off with a doctor performing a strange experiment to give a woman a sort of spiritual experience that they call seeing the great god Pan. The ritual succeeds, and then the story is taken up some years later as the characters gradually come to realize the consequences of this kind of occult meddling through strange behaviors, implied sexual immorality, and grotesque disfigurements. This is a true classic of the genre, written in 1894, and it was quite sensational for its time. In fact, though modern readers, jaded by the excesses of the horror genre in the decades since, might find this to be pretty tame, Its content did actual harm to its author's reputation back in the day. Despite that, it's been cited as an inspiration for just about everyone who followed in the horror genre, including Bram Stoker, Stephen King, and H.P. Lovecraft. In my opinion, I think the latter influence is the most directly observable, but they all claimed influence or inspiration from this book. The real question is how well it holds up for modern readers. Is it a great and timeless horror novel that we'll all continue to love, similar to something like Dracula or Frankenstein? Or is it a sort of proto-horror novel of interest really only to those engaged in a study of the genre's history? The answer is honestly somewhere in between. Because so much has been done in the genre since its publication, I don't think this one has the ability to really shock or scare its audiences anymore, though it is clear to see how many of our modern tropes developed from it. But even if you're not a genre historian, I still think you'll find it a good read, if not particularly a frightening one. It does require perhaps a bit more effort on the part of the reader than many of us might be accustomed to, but if you take your time with it, and if you give it its due, I think you'll still find it rewarding. My edition of the book, which is the Dover Thrift Edition, because I'm a poor, and by the way, there are links to my books down in the What's It as well if you want me to be less of a poor, but never mind that for right now. What I was going to say is that my edition of the book also includes 3 other short stories or novellas: The White People, The Inmost Light, and The Shining Pyramid. While lesser known than the title novella, these works are also very much worth a read, and I actually think some of them are at least on par with their more famous cousin. They may not have had as broad an influence, but some of them might actually be more, what would you say, palatable to modern readers. My reading of the classics of horror didn't stop there, though. My next book was Count Magnus and Other Ghost Stories by M.R. James. And though these stories were published around the same time as the previous book, perhaps up to a few decades later, they're similarly influential, but perhaps even more to my own taste in the genre. M.R. James was, of course, known primarily as an author of ghost stories, though he had quite an impressive academic career, and his fiction was really more of a hobby in his own life, even though it's what we remember him for these days. What's interesting about these stories is that, though they all seem to follow a similar formula, some old antiquarian ends up dealing with a terrifying ghostly encounter of some sort, they nevertheless each remain quite entertaining to read, and they each possess their own character despite their similarities. Now, some of my saying so is probably just personal taste on my part. Even if they do follow a formula, I like stories that involve specters of the past haunting the present, and I happen to like antiquarians as characters because though James was never a true master of the well-rounded and fully fleshed-out character study, I nevertheless see some of myself in his characters. But even if I put personal tastes aside, I know I'm at least not alone in praising these ghost stories because plenty of other scholars have seen similar value in them. Perhaps what's most interesting is how James's ghosts borrow from and diverge from other authors' visions of the incorporeal. These ghosts aren't the spooky visions of Victorian characters we've all come to associate with the genre. These ghosts are rougher around the edges. They're primitive, perhaps even primeval, and yet they haunt people and places in a manner strikingly similar to the cliché we're all familiar with. I think a deeper study reveals on the part of the author, himself a historical scholar, a certain uneasiness with the relationship between past and present. As far as I'm concerned, that's an uneasiness we ought to spend more time exploring for ourselves. Putting aside scholarly considerations, though, these are just pure fun ghost stories. And that's the kind of horror that I most like. It's quiet and intellectual in its approach. Yes, I love splatterpunk and gore and all of that from time to time, too. I'm really all over the place in this genre, but my favorites, the ones that really stick with me, and the ones I return to time and again, are usually the ones that aim to unsettle the mind rather than the stomach. That's best accomplished with creepiness rather than overt violence, and M.R. James was a master of that kind of horror. If you haven't read any of James before, I really can't recommend his works highly enough. And because they are primarily short stories, you can take them on just whenever you happen to have a spare moment. My next book, while still a classic, was a divergence from the horror genre. In fact, my next couple books were divergences from my favorite genre and presumably yours, but I still review them anyway because I know at least some of my viewers have similarly eclectic tastes, and, well, I like to review all the books that I've been reading. Anyway, the next one I picked up was something lighter and more humorous because I'd been having a bit of a rough day and needed something to lift my spirits. And to do that, I chose The Inimitable Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse. These Jeeves stories are among my very favorites. It's really rare that I find a book, even a humorous book, that actually has moments of humor sufficient to make me really laugh out loud. This novel, which consists of interconnected short stories about the dim-witted Bertie Wooster and his brilliant valet Jeeves, that this novel manages to pull that off is already a triumph. But it's even better than that because the laugh-out-loud moments alternate with a sort of general lightheartedness that permeates the entire text, punctuated occasionally with a truly thought-provoking line. Wodehouse was one of the true masters of English comedy, and everyone ought to read these Jeeves books. Incidentally, there's also a wonderful television adaptation of these stories, starring Hugh Laurie as Wooster and Stephen Fry as Jeeves. It's quite a faithful adaptation, and I'd highly recommend that as well. But by all means, read the books first. Next up, you may recall from last month that I reread The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. And in that review, I argued that though far from a traditional ghosts and gore kind of a horror story, Lewis actually wrote something that, given due thought, is far more frightening than most horror stories, and that The Screwtape Letters could and maybe should be considered a member of our genre. Well, this month I returned to the same author, still no relation to myself, although I also still keep hoping to discover some long-forgotten link in the family tree. Never mind that, but I continued my reading of the same author this month with Mere Christianity. Inspired by, and largely but not entirely transcribed from, a series of radio lectures given during World War II, this is C.S. Lewis's attempt to provide a rational defense of Christian doctrine starting from first principles. It's become quite a classic in that genre, but it's also difficult to review because its value largely depends on what the reader himself brings to the table. Though Lewis makes a strong attempt at a rational defense of the faith, the pure agnostic or atheist or member of a conflicting faith likely won't find the arguments from first principles entirely convincing. Meanwhile, the staunch Christian won't really find anything new beyond perhaps an artful way of expressing established ideas and doctrines. Indeed, even a quotation here on the cover of my edition from Anthony Burgess sort of makes my case for me. He wrote, C.S. Lewis is the ideal persuader for the half-convinced. The target audience for this book, then, seems to be someone already largely convinced to join the Christian church of some denomination or other, or at least someone already interested in the Christian church, if only for purely intellectual or cultural reasons, but whose intellect desires a deeper understanding of why that particular faith believes what it does, and why its members act as they do. One important point is that the book is accessible and palatable to individuals of a wide variety of backgrounds. Lewis carefully avoids doctrinal or practical differences between, for instance, the Anglicans and the Baptists and the Catholics, focusing on mere Christianity in the sense that his focus is on the core doctrines common to the entire faith. Indeed, even those readers outside the faith will find it a useful exposition of the faith, which renders some of the superficially strange-sounding doctrines, if not believable to the non-believing reader, at least more understandable. Where modern readers, particularly the non-Christian ones, will struggle, though, is that the arguments Lewis tackles are almost entirely limited to the philosophical and the moral. That's all very well, and I do think we as modern people ought to spend more time grappling with the philosophical and the moral. But we have now spent many decades immersed in a culture focused much more on the empirical and the scientific, and those arguments are not covered here in any great detail. That's not really a fault with the book itself, though one could certainly argue that a work written during World War II perhaps ought to have foreseen the materialism of the post-war culture. But though I don't really fault the author for that, it does render the book perhaps less applicable to many of those among its modern readership that it might otherwise have reached. At the end of the day, I'm not trying to argue that Lewis is correct or incorrect in his conclusions. I have my own ideas, and I'm sure you do as well. And if you're anything like me, those ideas about philosophy and religion are constantly evolving with everything that I read. A book review isn't going to be the place to settle millennia-old questions. What I will say, though, is that whether you're a Christian or an atheist or a member of some other faith, this would be a great and accessible book to start with on your quest to understand the Christian perspective. Just make sure you follow it up with something that does address those more empirical questions for a more complete picture. My next two books go together and require sort of a preface or a disclaimer before I talk about them. Y'all know I like to stay informed, and that includes reading some political books. But at the same time, I don't like these videos to get bogged down in politics, and I certainly don't want flame wars down in the comments section. We are here to share our love of horror, and occasionally to discuss the other books that I've been reading, but not to argue with each other, because I know I have people across all political and religious and philosophical orientations or affiliations watching these videos. But at the same time, I do like to provide a complete record in these review videos of all the books I've been reading. So I'm always sort of conflicted about what to do when it comes to the more controversial or political ones. In this case, I wanted to read some books that might help me to understand current events, and specifically about the way President Trump thinks about and approaches things. But I also very specifically wanted to read on both sides. So what I settled on was to pair two books together and to read them at the same time. One in favor of the president and one against the president. And I settled on sort of biographical works that might help me understand the events that shaped his thinking. One of those was his own Art of the Deal, and the other was Too Much and Never Enough by his niece and noted detractor, Mary Trump. Both of these deal not with current events, but with Donald Trump before he was the president, so I was hoping to learn something about his character independent of what we all read in the political headlines. And I'm not going to review them in great depth because I don't want this to be a political argument. What I will say is that with respect to The Art of the Deal, it's really a lot more biographical than normative. By that I mean that despite the title, he really never explicitly explains his deal-making strategy. Instead, he just describes his favorite real estate deals from his past, at least up to the point of the book's publication in the 1980s. And then with respect to Too Much and Never Enough, it actually ends up being less a criticism of Donald Trump himself and more a criticism of his father, Fred Trump. So at the end of the day, I thought they were both interesting, but neither quite gave me the perspective that I was actually looking for. So it was kind of a failed experiment on both sides. And that's really all I'll say by way of review, is that they're not quite what I was expecting. Yes, I have my thoughts and preferences about each of them, and of course I have my political views, but in the interest of goodwill among my viewers, I'm going to leave this here and just move back to the horror genre. And, in fact, the next horror novel I read was an interesting one I had never heard of until quite recently, and I picked up a copy. And it's called A Bloody Habit by Eleanor Borg Nicholson. The idea of this novel, as I understood it before reading it, was that it would present a vampire story, very much in the style of Bram Stoker's Dracula, but from a Catholic perspective, or with a Catholic sensibility, even, in fact, featuring a vampire-slaying Dominican friar, of all things. And now that I have read it, that's pretty accurate. But fortunately, it's first and foremost a good and entertaining novel. Yes, it's very Catholic in its approach, but not in a way that it seems intended only for Catholic readers. In very much the same way that The Exorcist is very Catholic in its approach, and in fact that was one of my criticisms of the latest Exorcist movie, was that they diverged from the story's Catholic origins. But nobody thinks that you have to be Catholic to like The Exorcist. It's one of the greatest books and movies ever written or filmed. It just happens to be told from that perspective, and that's the same thing here. In fact, though much of the action does center on a rather amusing character of a Dominican vampire hunter, the narrator in this tale is a skeptical agnostic attorney, so it does a good job of balancing its, what would you say, papist perspective with a strong outsider's perspective. And indeed, it is also very much in line with Stoker's approach to the vampire novel. It takes place at around the same time, and even features both Bram Stoker himself and his novel as characters of sorts in the action, and it follows many similar plot points, but it is not a retelling of Dracula. The writing style does a good job of mimicking Stoker's epistolary style, while also coming across as more standard for modern readers. Clearly, the author knows and respects the work she used as inspiration. In fact, my understanding is that she also edited or provided commentary for a critical edition of Dracula in the past for the same Catholic press that published this book. But despite all the Catholic themes and history behind the book, it doesn't just read like shameless mackerel-snapping popery page after page either. Yes, the book's theological interpretation of vampirism is Catholic, but it reads very much just like any other horror novel. I admit it took me a short while to get into it. The first chapter sets it up to look like an almost comic sort of a novel, or at least, if not comic, at least a light-hearted one. but it then takes a turn and becomes a very serious, slow burn of a horror story. Don't expect frights and gore on every page here. Much like Dracula itself, this book does take its time. I actually like that. I think the reason it threw me off a little bit was just because that opening scene set different expectations than the novel ultimately delivered. I do like the opening scene, and I do like the rest of the novel, but they sort of worked at crossed purposes a little bit. But once it does get going, it ends up being quite an exciting book that deals with matters of mystery, faith, grief, science, skepticism, and yes, vampires and the band of Dominicans who hunt them. And once it heads toward a climax, it picks up the pace substantially and rewards in grand style the reader who stuck with it through a few moments that might have dragged just a little bit earlier on. I don't hear a lot of people talking about this book, or indeed this author, in horror circles, probably because it was published by a religious press instead of a known horror publisher. But I, for one, will certainly be back to read more of her works in the future. My next and last two books for this month are both technically non-fiction, but I still consider them both related to horror, but in completely different ways. The first of them is called The End of Ownership: Personal Property in the Digital Economy by Aaron Perzanowski and Jason Schultz. Though this book was published a few years ago, I think it's become increasingly relevant as our economy shifts, much to my own great displeasure, toward much more digital-only media and away from physical property. If I can be forgiven for attempting to summarize an entire book in so short a phrase, the basic thesis here comes down to the fact that our laws and our business practices have done a terrible job of adapting well-established and settled legal concepts from the physical space to the digital one. The most basic example would be a book, perhaps even the very book we're discussing. Because I bought this physical copy, I have ownership of this copy. I can do with it as I wish. I can read it or not. I did, and so I guess at this point I could say I can reread it or not. I can put it on my shelf and I can keep it. I can lend it to a friend. I can sell it. I could destroy it. Not that I ever would do such a thing. Basically, I can do almost whatever I want with it, short of copying it and redistributing those copies, as that would be a violation of intellectual property law. In other words, separate bodies of law govern the physical property of a single book, this copy of the book, for example, and the intellectual property of its contents. Great. We all seem to understand that, at least on some level. But in the digital world, we all, quote-unquote, buy ebooks and other digital files, only to find that we haven't actually purchased the same ownership interest in those digital goods as we would have their physical counterparts. We often can't resell an ebook because, for instance, there's no way of knowing how many additional copies were generated in the process of making the sale. One of the things they mention in this book is that the very process of transferring a file creates an unknown number of partial or complete intermediary files. Even if that weren't the case, and even if that could be controlled, if I have a digital book and I email it to somebody, I still have the original file. Whereas if I sell this book to somebody, I give them the thing and I don't have the thing anymore. So they do behave quite differently. This book does an excellent job of explaining these conflicts in ownership and intellectual property rights in this digital economy. And it's one of the most frightening books I've read, at least within the last couple of years, because it describes a near future in which we might not really own much of anything, but only license all of our products from companies that can strip them away from us at will. And it doesn't just extend to media like books or movies. One of the really frightening things that they talk about a little bit is we end up with all of these smart products that can just be turned off remotely. And in such an economy, can we really be thought to own those items? These are all among the many reasons I'm a strong proponent of physical media. You'll notice I have real books here. But despite that personal preference, even I have to admit that digital products are here to stay, and we need to come to terms with how to deal with them properly. Perhaps even more frightening than that is that the work of solving those problems is going to require the effort of far more capable and far more serious legislators than we seem to have at the moment. And I do mean on both sides of the political aisle. I don't trust the Democrats or the Republicans right now to be serious and sober enough to handle these complicated of issues, but I digress, and once again, I'm trying not to get into politics here too much. Anyway, though I may not always like the truths it has to tell, this book itself is quite good. The authors don't shy away from detailed legal analyses, but explain the various court rulings and jargon when it's necessary in such a way that it's perfectly accessible to non-expert non-lawyers. And even as something of a legal nerd myself, I really did learn a lot from this book that I didn't already know, even though, like I said, I'm a legal nerd and these issues are particularly relevant in my industries. Better still, lest we allow the book's message to get us too down, the authors also take some time to suggest both short and long-term solutions that, while admittedly incomplete and not fully fleshed out, would go a long way towards solving these issues. Furthermore, though AI is not at all the topic of this book, I think much of its analysis concerning the balance of rights between intellectual property rights holders and purchasers of copies of those properties really could go a long way toward promoting, let's say, a more productive conversation in the various AI controversies that we've all been talking about of late as well. At the end of the day, this might not be the kind of exciting page-turner that typically tops the bestseller lists, but I consider this a must-read, not only for those of us in industries where products are becoming increasingly digital, but also for everyone who might consider purchasing any media product ever, and before long, any product at all. And that brings us to the last book of the month, and also one more directly related to the horror genre than its predecessor, even though it is still nonfiction. And the book is called The Big Book of Pain: Torture and Punishment Through History by Mark P. Donnelly and Daniel Deal. When I picked this up, I was looking for essentially an encyclopedia of torture methods, perhaps presented chronologically and in their historical context, or maybe even just presented alphabetically or whatever. I was looking for an encyclopedia of torture methods. That's not quite what this is. It certainly does feature a large number of such methods, some of which are described in text, but most of which are also accompanied either by photographs, such as the one on the cover of Historic Artifacts, or artists' renditions of the devices in practice. But rather than just being a catalog of devices and methods, it's a much more complete history of torture through the centuries. It does have a European focus throughout most of the book, but also includes some chapters relatively late in the book on other regions throughout the world. And honestly, it's fascinating. Perhaps bits of it can be a little repetitive because as inventive as humans can be when it comes to the things we do to each other, we can also be lazy enough to not reinvent the wheel, pun intended, when we don't need to. But overall, it presents a succinct history not only of the devices and of the methods, but also of the codes of laws, legal and moral reasoning, and so forth, that have led to the increases and decreases and evolutions of such practices throughout history. My biggest complaint, I think, is that the authors define their subject a bit more narrowly than I think would have been best. They discuss only legally sanctioned punitive practices used either in punishment for violation of civil laws or, in some cases, punishment for violation of religious doctrines. Obviously, that's a big, important topic and a huge piece of the subject, but I would have personally preferred if they had defined the scope of their topic a little more broadly and included extrajudicial or even criminal cases as well, because as methodologically inventive as legal authorities and religious authorities have been, individuals and bands of other people have also come up with mind-bogglingly obscene tortures that I think would have been also interesting to read about in parallel with what is in this book. At the end of the day, while it wasn't quite as encyclopedic as I was hoping for in some ways, it did end up treating me to a rich and fascinating history that kept me turning the pages well into the evening. So, honestly, despite a couple of quibbles, I have to heartily recommend it. Well, that does it. Quite an eclectic mix this month, as usual. And of course, because it always takes me a little while to get these review videos filmed and posted, I am now already well underway with my reading for April. And I can tell you, you're not going to want to miss that review video either. I started off strong with some extreme horror, but I've also got some more horrifying nonfiction, some quieter horror, and, as usual, a bit of everything else lined up for April. As always, I appreciate everyone who stuck with me to the end of this video. Just as a quick reminder before I sign off, if you're interested in any of these books, I do have those purchase links for you right down there in the What's It. And while you're checking those out, also be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and ring my bell. But now, alas, it's time for me to sign off and go continue with that reading for April. So until next time, take care and stay scared.